Hello everyone! I've just read chapter 5 of Coruscant Nights, Street of Shadows, or Western Jedi Twilight. So we pick up with Aura Singh, and I knew she was going to be in this book. But we pick up with Aura Singh, and she is serving a criminal sentence on the planet of Uva 4. I think it's Uva 4. And she's mining Xenium, and we're giving... The main point of the chapter is literally on the last page, really. It's on the last 2 pages of the chapter. The rest of the chapter is basically just telling us stuff about Aura Singh and Uber 4. We're told about we're told about Singh's past, and she's at this point once we get started being told stuff about Singh, she's making her way out of the mine on the repulsor lift thing. And we're being told about her past, how she knew her mother was human, but she didn't know what species his father was. And although someone like Welawuga the Hutt, or whatever it was, had suggested a variety of species, but none of them could interbreed with humans without genetic tampering, and even then that would not explain Aura Singh's longevity. And we're told that the one that she refers to as the Dark Woman had almost convinced her to stay on the jet, had almost convinced her to embrace the Jedi Code. And then that was when she was kidnapped by pirates, and they pretty much reversed all of that, and she of course now then became a Jedi hunter. Not the same ones from Ninth Jedi, because this has come out because I'm recording this after Ninth Jedi. Not those Jedi hunters, but you know, she hunts Jedi, and we're told again about how the language that is used, the wording that's used, I think that's the correct word, in this chapter very much shows that she holds disdain for Jedi, and we're told that because she had basically become a Jedi hunter, she was able to survive Order 66, and she thinks that it's good riddance, but it's a shame because she doesn't really have many Jedi to hunt now. And then we told a bit about Uva 4, about how only the worst criminals are sent here, and we're told about how the Xenium eventually kills the prisoners, because even though they're wearing respirators to protect themselves, eventually the Xenium dust gets into the respirators, and it winds up and the dust basically starts eating them out from the inside, eating them up from the inside, sorry, which of course slowly kills them. And we're also told about how this is how Uva 4 is basically one of the few labour camps that still uses actual people and not droids, because the Xenium sends the droids, affects the droids, and they can't properly work. We're told that the only reason it's using people is, of course, for cost effectiveness, not ethics. Anyway, Aura Singh passes by an almost hairless blind Wookiee who's I can't remember his name, but he's nosing up some Xenium into a tube, and she stops and starts nosing the Xenium into the tube, her own Xenium into the tube, so you can be taken to the surface, or no, it's somewhere else. But then we're told about how Aura Singh had survived so long, partly because when things get tough, she just waits them out. She just waits it out because of her longevity. She doesn't really know a whole lot about herself. She doesn't know what species she is. She doesn't know how old she is. But she basically just waits things out. If times are tough, and waits for things to get better. And we're told about how one of the reasons she'd survived so long on Uva 4 is partly because of you know, her reputation. And a connection to the Force. Also, I was wrong. It's only on the last 4 pages of the chapter does the chapter get to the point. And we're told that Aurra Singh is surprised when her connection to the Force does not tell her that about an incoming attack from a Trandoshan. And we're told that a transplant she has which has its antennae, removed by Ayla Secura, almost says Ayla Singh, by Ayla Secura. It can still work, but only recognize a threat at close range. And other the Force, for some reason, doesn't tell Aurra that there's an attack coming on, and she very quickly takes out the Trandoshan. She breaks his arm and dislocates it and trips the Trandoshan, and she takes his shiv, which I assume is a vibro shiv, considering it's said to be releasing some, said to be shaking. She can feel the breeze from it, so I assume it's a vibro shiv. And then Darth Vader appears. And we're told about how Aurra has heard quite a few things about rumours about Vader. I'll just read some of them off. She recognised the figure, of course. One could hardly live in a developed portion of the galaxy, or even on its fringes, and not have heard of Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith. His origins were shrouded in mystery and rife with rumour. He was a centuries-old Sith Lord, reanimated by the sheer force of the Emperor's will. He was the last rogue Jedi. He was a genetically optimized clone, the ultimate warrior. He was a cyborg, some kind of specialized battle droid, given human form. Singh had no idea which, if any of the rumors might be true, although Vader's alleged unequaled proficiency with a lightsaber would seem to argue for the first or second possibility. And she first looks at his lightsaber on his belt, and she isn't really intimidated by Vader. And Vader says that, you know, she's done well. And Singh asks if he set this up, and Vader just nods, and he starts talking, and Aurra Singh interrupts him. And Aurra says that he's lucky he wasn't here in person, otherwise, you know, she would attack him. And then Vader but Vader cuts her off before she can finish saying what she was saying, and he says that he has an offer for her. Now, I'm just going to read out the conversation because it's going to be so much easier if I do. Your reflexes are quite impressive, Bounty Hunter. You have temporarily cost me the use of a trained assassin. Singh spared a glance at the Trandoshan still lying on the floor, whimpering softly as he tried to snap his broken arm into its shoulder socket. Her gaze returned to the ebon image. You set this one on me. Why? Vader nodded once. Just so. I was curious to see if you were still at your peak after your time in the mines. You're wise, she interrupted the projection, to stay in a safe haven parsecs away. This one, she nudged the reptiloid with her foot, just served to keep you from falling asleep after a day's work. Were you here in the flesh-eyed? Vader raised the gloved black hand, and he explains that he has a job for her. And he says that do it well and he'll personally commute her sentence. Do it badly, she'll return back to Uber for basically the rest of her life. And Aurra Singh says, well, you make an offer that even a fool would be had the common sense to actually take, you know. And Vader says, very well, we have a deal. And then Aurra Singh is surprised when it doesn't turn off. And during the conversation, she had noted 3 individuals who were looking at her and scowling. And she then realises that they're waiting to see who attacks first, which one of the 3 will attack first. And Aurra Singh realises that the test isn't over, and that's where we end the chapter. Now, I haven't really read any stories with Aura Singh, just like how I haven't really read any stories with Dender and I5 up until Jedi Twilight. Um, but this was, I think, a really good, at least for me, a really good introduction to her character. We get to learn basically all you need to know about her character. You know, we learn about her past, we learn about, um, you know, what she does. We don't really learn why she's on Uber 4, but I can assume it's probably due to some sort of, you know, crime she's done, nasty crime. Because again, it says that really only the worst of the criminals get sent to Uber for. Also, the Wookiee that I brought up earlier, he doesn't even remember what crime he's done. He's been there so long, so the poor Wookiee. But um, yeah, I was and again, this was also again the first time that I've really seen Aura Singh's character as well. You know, I know I just said this is the first time I see it, but I mean in like how she acts, etc. Um, and the way she spoke to Vader really shows just how she's not scared of him at all. You know, she has the audacity to interrupt Vader. She has the audacity to threaten Vader. Vader doesn't do anything to stop her. He doesn't choke her or anything. He doesn't give into anger or anything. He just cuts her off and gets back to what he was saying once he has enough of what she's saying. Um, and I think that really just shows the fierceness of her character. You know, and it's oh, it's a shame because I know Aura's been in other stuff, other books before this, but it's such a shame because it's in this one chapter. I think, has shown probably more character than Namath has throughout most of the rest of the Jedi books. And the only interaction she has in this chapter is with Vader, well, speaking interaction. So it really is, Laventh, you kind of need to catch up a bit. Again, not to say that Laventh doesn't have any character. Again, she does have some character, she just doesn't have a whole lot. Um, it's really mainly just her past and the different concepts surrounding her character that I think I find interesting, and there's, again, little bits about her character are also quite interesting, but I think she just needs a little bit more to be well-rounded. Um, and I think, anyway, back to what I was saying, I think I was interested to see how she get involved in this story. And it looks, and I assume that Vader, and it doesn't really quite explain why, but it does look like Vader's probably going to be hiring her to see if Jax is still alive, or and if so, to bring him to him again. Um, but yeah, again, I quite enjoy this chapter. It does kind of fall into the trap of what last book did, where it just when it got really into the character's history. But I think because there are less characters, because we've only read, technically it's 3 out of 2 chapters, but we haven't really spent a whole lot of time in characters past in the book so far. I know this is only chapter 5, but you know, we haven't really been going into each and every character's history to a great extent so far. You know, we're quickly caught up with our main characters. We didn't go completely into detail, but we were quickly caught up with the essential information. We were then introduced to Fess Villette and Deja Duer, and again, we didn't really learn a whole lot about them, but we did learn quite a bit about Fess in the moments of the chapter, you know, what the chapter was about. And here with our scene, we do go into her past, and I think this is really the first time in this book that we've really gone into detail in a character's past before, and I think that just makes it feel a bit better. I think that makes it feel a bit better, that there aren't so many characters that we have to keep track of and introduce their pasts, etc. You know, it, we just it So I think with Odyssey it works a bit better than it is the last chapter, the last book, just because there are a lot less characters that we're having to learn about. Um, so yeah, I think it works a lot better in this book than it did in the previous book. Even though it was in the exact same way, it was just in the last book we were being introduced to, about five different characters, well, six different characters, and being told their history. No, seven actually, and it was we were actually being told them each time a new character appeared, and so that kind of got in the book, and it got just. And it was a bit of a struggle to in the early chapters. Here, it's only been the one so far, and even though we have been introduced to Vess and Deja, we don't really know a whole lot about them. So I like how you know, it's just Obviously who's had an in-depth dive into her past in this chapter, and I think it works well here because again we're not going into multiple characters. Um, Uber 4 is is an interesting place. It is an interesting place. Um, Personally though, I this may just be because I really do like Last of the Jedi, but I do think I prefer I can't remember what the planet was called now. Um, but in like Death on the Boo, the place where Ferris was at, I think maybe that one was more developed. It was quite developed because we kind of got to see the community there. But I think for all the purposes of this book, Over 4 is developed enough. We're only on it so we can learn about just get Ola Singh out of there and get her into the main story really. So it's not really unlike Ferris in the Death on the Boo, where he had been sent there, and that's the fourth book in the series. He's been in all the previous ones where he had to spend time waiting for him to escape. Here, I think it works a bit better. Well, not a bit better. I think it is better in Death on the Boo, but here it suffices. We don't need to see all the community, but I think Death on the Boo does a good job of showing you that community there. Um, and showing their lives. And here we're just told about it. Is that a bad thing for this book? No. I think if it was a book specifically on Orasing, and this is like, and this is like the pickup point, it will probably be of a new book series or a new book. I haven't really spent much time in the mines. I think it will be problematic, but for these purposes of this book, it was good. I think we've learned enough about the place. Um, I think honestly, we might have learned a little bit too much, but we learned enough about the place, and that's all we really needed to know. Um, uh, I'm curious as to why Vader is calling upon Oba. I am curious as to what, and again, I think it is just going to come down to him still suspecting that Jax is alive and wanting to send someone after him. Um, One thing that is a little bit off topic though, something that is interesting me is Rahinian. Because he hasn't had a lot to do in this book so far. Or literally the only thing he's done in this book is hand Jax the Velmorian energy stores. That's literally all he's done in the book. I've been told what he does now, but yeah, and I am going to be quite curious as to whether he will see Vader again, and if he does, how Vader's going to react. Because I think Vader would just, kill him. But yeah, I wonder what Rahinian's up to. Um, but I think that brings an end to this review. I'm running out of things to talk about because really, this is one of those chapters where there's a lot in it, but there's not a lot to talk about. It goes on about lots of different things, but really you can't really talk about a whole lot of it that's in the chapter just because there's not really just because in general there's not really enough to really keep talking about. Um, I do know that we don't learn anything more about Ola Singh's history. I know that we don't learn who her father was or what he was. I know we don't learn how old she is, I'm fairly sure. So, I'm not expecting any reveals like that because I know that won't happen, and also how would it happen? But it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how this all goes. How this all goes. But yeah, I think that brings an end to this review. So thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone, I've just read chapter 6 of Coruscant Nights, Street of Shadows. This is definitely the longest chapter we've had in Coruscant Nights so far. And I think it's my least favourite chapter because of just how long it is. And also personally, there's just so many words in this chapter that I was unfamiliar with. I was basically having to stop every other sentence, and a lot of the times, it would sometimes feel like every other word in a sentence, just to Google up what the words were meaning. I probably got through about some pages. It probably took me about, if I was able to read through a page like I usually do, I probably would have been done. I probably could have read that page 2 times. If it wasn't for the amount of words that was in it. This chapter was really difficult for me, both because of the length and again just the amount of unfamiliar words that was used for me. But we basically pick up with Jax presenting that Anakin is alive to everyone else, and everyone's very skeptical of it. And Dana's finding it hard to believe, Laren's finding it hard to believe, and she argues that with the exception of them, there are no more Jedi left. And Jax says exactly, with the exception of them, what's to say that other Jedi aren't alive? Um, And I5 mentions that there have been rumours that Obi-Wan, Mace Windu and Anakin have been seen since the rise of the Empire, but there's never been any confirmation. And then Jackson now sent someone coming, and it turns out it's Deja Duer, who's asking, and she asks, who does is anyone here Jax Pavan? Then we cut over to Typho, who's finally arriving on Coruscant, and it's his first appearance in the book since the prologue. Um, and the first course of action he's intending to do is to find a way to get into the temple. Because if Anakin really was the last Jedi that saw Padme, there might be some information on his whereabouts in the temple. So that's where he's planned to go. Takes place, that happens over about we're told basically that over 3 pages. Typho is about 3 pages of that, and I just explained all pretty much everything you really need to know about that. Was essential, a couple of sentences there. Anyway, then we pick up with Deja Duer, and she brings up that she says that Jax speaks up and says that yes, I am Jax, and Deja says that she's heard that they give safe passage to people, and she asks if they can give her and her partner safe passage to another world. And she says she's willing to pay, and then there's a very funny moment where Den says, those are those 4 favourite words, I can pay. And he immediately gets energetic and pops up and goes, well, for the right price, we can take you anywhere, etc. And then Larenth shoots him a look, which completely stops him in his tracks. And Jax says that she doesn't have to pay. And we're told about how Zeltrons, which is what Deja is, can also release pheromones similar to the Feline. And they also have telepathy, which is basically they are able to communicate emotions, not just thoughts. And then kind of wonders what's the point of the pheromones, and if they have telepathy that can manipulate others. But Jax still seems to be level-headed, and he brings a couple to Den. But Jax winds up saying that the Whiplash are being investigated by the Empire because they're interested in how the Whiplash's techniques to get people off worlds, and so it's more dangerous than ever. But he says that considering how the recent Kamasi have been, eliminated, he feels it would only be fair to give Deja and Vestfolet off world to get them off world. And when Deja does bring up that Vestfolet is her work partner, and she later brings up that I5 inquires if it's a famous artist, and Deja says that yes, he was quite well known, well known on his own world, and he brings up that Vest, like many artists, is a bit out of touch with galactic society. Her words, and that she's worried she might make an art piece that will make that will upset the Emperor in spite to God's spite. The destruction of Kamas, and she just wants to get them off world. And we're told that no doubt from Den's perspective, we're told that no doubt is the Empire going to be looking for survivors of the Kamas Holocaust, as it's referred to in the book, and because they don't want Palpatine will certainly not want any people asking awkward questions about it, and so he knows that anyone who's going to be involved with that is going to get questioned as well, so he's all of a sudden not feeling very inclined. And when he hears Jax say that he's willing to help them off world, he slaps his head with one hand and groans. And I5 asks if he's alright, and he says, "Oh, he's just got a headache," and he walks out. And we're basically told about how Den's really struggling. About the only reason why he's staying on Coruscant is because I5 is staying on Coruscant, and he's brought up many times to get off world sooner rather than later, so they can get away from Vader. He's not comfortable with how close they are. They're on the same planet. Um, he wants to get as much space between them and Vader as possible. Um, and we're told about how he wonders what I5 would do, because even though he had said he would only stay with Jax on Coruscant if Den would stay, he also he remembers just he spent decades looking for Jax, and now Den's wondering if he'll try and make up for that lost time to fulfill. Given he was given the last command he was given by Lorne Pavan, Jax's father, was to find and look after his son. And then just wonders if it came to it, who would I5 choose, Den or Jax? And he just doesn't want to find out. He doesn't want to find out. And we then told about how he really doesn't like the Coruscant underworld, and we're reminded about how awful it is. And we were told that even though the Sulustans, which is what Den is, are cave dwellers, he still really doesn't like the Coruscant underworld just because of how nasty it is. And we're given about a 2-page, basically just 2 pages telling us about how nasty the underworld is and how people tend to be negligent of it because they come into Coruscant for luxury, not to be reminded of how awful about all the species down below that are suffering. And then the chapter basically ends on saying that Den isn't speciesist. And there was another thing that we went on to. What was it? It says that each species is spent enough time with other species to not really put one above another. Um, but he just, but yeah, yeah, it's just sticking on what referred to how nasty the underground is, the underworld is, because of personal hygienes. Um, and then we're told about, and then he thinks about how, humans are so present. And then we're told about something from that Rahinian had told Den, which was that the Empire were intending to segregate humans from other species on Coruscant. And Den is just completely can't believe it because of how many humans and species there are on Coruscant and other species, etc. And that he's sure that it will cause a massive uprising that will put the final days of the Clone Wars to shame. Um, and it says that if that wasn't cause for Celan, he didn't know what was. And Celan, which is a Celestan word, was described as what was it? Celan. That was the word for it in Celeste tongue. It meant quietude, a sensation of unrest, a troubled heart. It was a word that described with fair accuracy Dender's mental state these days. Um, Finally we get to the point of the book, and I'm so happy we got to it in chapter 6 rather than chapter 10. That's not bad going. That's 4 chapters sooner than it was the last book. So I'm glad we got to the point. And I do wonder if Den and I-Fi, if Den is actually going to continue, is actually going to be in the next book. Because I get the feeling he may go with Vess and Deja. And I have a feeling he might go with them. Uh, so I'm going to be interested to see if he's in the next book. I think he will be in the Last Jedi book. I think he will be in that one, but it'll be interesting to see if he is even in Coruscant Nights 3. Um, so yeah. Again, we get to the point. Of course, Anakin's brought up. Yeah, there's just so much in this chapter, and I think, again, I really struggle with this chapter, and it was one, the length. The one thing I was dreading going into this book was it was 300 pages, and it was only 30 chapters. The last book was 46 pages and was about 340 chapters. It basically meant in that book, chapters could be very short. And I was really happy for that, because there was just so many chapters that the chapters would be very short. They were very digestible. Here, the chapters have got to be longer, because there's less chapters. And it's still a 300-page book. It's about almost 40 pages shorter, but still a 300-page book. And because of that, it means that there are going to be some chapters, like chapter 6, that I'm going to find unbearable. Because, personally, I do not like long chapters. I absolutely despise long chapters because I'm someone who reads a chapter from start to finish. I cannot pause halfway through a chapter. Otherwise, I have to go back, and I do not like going back because I already know this, but I just need to remind myself in case I forget anything. I hate this is why I go from the start to the end of the chapter. I can't just pause it. There are definitely some books. There are definitely some chapters, and I think chapter 6 is definitely an example of this book where you could just pause the chapter. When it swaps over its storyline to someone else. This swaps over 4 times. It was started on Jax, then it swaps over to Typho, then it swapped back over to Jax, then it swaps over to Den. And I definitely could have just paused the book each time to just swap over. But personally, I do not like doing that. I just do not like doing that. And I think particularly when we got to Den's bit in the book, where he, leaves the room and just starts musing on everything. Um, the final page is there. The amount of words that were being used that I was unfamiliar with was absolutely ridiculous. It was ridiculous. I again, as I brought up earlier, I probably could have gone through that page twice, maybe even three or four times by the time I actually got through one of the pages. Um, I could have probably gone through it about 2 to 4 times if it was like the other pages. I do usually do have to Google something, at least one thing on the page. I usually always have to Google when I read a chapter. It's why I always read next to my computer. That way I can type things in and search up the meanings of words. Because I don't, because I have, because it's not like non-fiction where even if you don't catch everything, you're gonna still at least learn something. In fiction, you have to pay attention to every single detail, otherwise you're gonna miss something important. And so, as much as I do like reading fiction and non-fiction, it's not really much of my thing. It can get a bit annoying at times, and this was a prime example of how annoying it can get. And it's one of those things where it's just tell us, um, uh, just use a simpler word. It would make it so much easier. It's instead of just using the technical term for a city-wide planet, just call it the city planet. Not what was it, an ecumenopolis? You know, it, just call it a city planet. You can still call it an ecumenopolis in other places, but it just makes it easier to read a chapter. Um, And this is one again. This is something I was complaining a lot with in Darth Plagueis. This is a complaint that I haven't really had much with Coruscant Nights at the moment. I don't think I've really complained about its use of words, but here this was definitely a problem for me at least. This is definitely just me, not being familiar with the words. For other people, they're going to be familiar, and it would have been such a hard read. But for me, I was unfamiliar with so many words in Dane's section of the chapter that I was getting through it at a snail's pace. And I don't read the fastest, but I can get through a page in a decent amount of time, and it was ridiculous. It was ridiculous, and especially since the chapter was already so long, I was already just wanting to get done with it, and I couldn't just go. I couldn't just zoom through it, so it made it really more annoying that was more toward the end of the chapter rather than toward the start. It was, if it was going to be a long chapter, I'd rather it be more towards. I'd rather that all those words would be more toward the start than the end. Um, but Jax, it's also brought up that he finds Deja very beautiful. Um, and that's another thing brought up. I haven't again, I'm not going to flip through the pages for this. This chapter was way too long, and I really do not want to look back on it. Kind of like chapter 4 of Luke Skywalker, The Shadows of Mindor. But this chapter is actually better than that chapter in Shadows of Mindor, so haha. But it's again, we just got to the point of the story here, and I'm glad that we got into it sooner, and I'm glad that this felt like the perfect time to bring us into this main plot of the story. I think last book it very much felt like that we were just putting it off, putting it off, putting it off, putting it off, and not really getting to the point of the story until it already felt a bit like it was too late. Um, Here, I think we got to the point in the story at the perfect time. We got introduced to the characters. We basically got all pre-story information that we really need, and I think now the story is kicking off at the right time. I think it's kicking off at the right time here. Um, so yeah, I think this was the perfect time to start the story. I think. It's just a shame it couldn't have been in a shorter chapter. Again, I think this book just this chapter, if it was, this could have been split into at least two chapters. It could have been split into two chapters. The first chapter being um Jax and then Typho, and then the second chapter being Jax interacting with you know, Deja, and then getting into Den's musings, or split into four different ones, or three, split into three, Jax, then Typho, and then both Jax and Den. This chapter could have been split up much more, and again, it would make the book so much better, I think. Because I know this is going to happen a lot more in the book, because there are 10 pages behind the actual chapter count. We're at page 60, and the next chapter is chapter 7, so we're kind of like 10 pages behind the actual chapter count in a way, and that's going to be problematic for some chapters. I mean, going into chapter 6, we were on page 49, so it's it just, I hope, you know this is just something that's, I know it's not going to be like this for the other books. I'm fairly sure, technically they got less chapters, but I really do hope that, the books don't feel as full, going into the third and and I'm going to count Last Jedi as Coruscant Nights for, as Coruscant into the third and fourth books. I do hope the chapters aren't quite as going to be feel as long, because again, one of the my biggest compliments of Jedi Twilight was the chapter length. They were perfect. It was absolutely perfect, the chapter length in those books, and there was in that book, and there was enough chapters to keep it consistently at that length. And this chapter very much could have. I think there are going to be parts in this book where it could very much benefit from having more chapters to keep the consistent chapter length. So, yeah. Uh, but again, I think I'm struggling to properly think about this chapter, mainly just because of how annoyed I am with just, how long it was, the actual the writing at times, but I'm struggling to properly think about this chapter, so I'm going to admit now. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm just complaining with this. Um, let's see. Let's think of some things that I could really talk about. Um, You understand why everyone else is skeptical about Anakin being alive. It is even brought up that Jax really would doubt it if he hasn't been given it by the Force. And he does say that if he was given a choice between to trust his senses or the Force, he'd take the Force every time. And I actually do wonder whether that's going to set something up where he's given a choice between the Force and his senses, and what winds up happening is that he chooses the Force, and his senses winds up being what would have actually been the better option. And trusting the Force brings them into some sort of tough situation. It sounds like that's setting up something. It sounds like it's more than just a line to make him believe, to try and convince the others of its belief. It sounds like it's also setting something up. So I'm going to be curious as to if that will lead to anything. I'm not sure if it will, but I'm going to be curious as to whether it will. Um, Curious as to how Deja even found Jax. I'm completely. And also, if Deja has heard about Jax, surely Vader has. If this random woman has knows that Jax is working with Whiplash and is taking people off world, surely Vader's gonna know. I'm curious as to how she even found him though. Typho, again, is still massively hit with grief. And I'm gonna be curious to see, what goes on in the Jedi Temple. This is his adventures in the Jedi Temple. The funny thing is, though, this was like a little bit earlier in the timeline, Typho might have wound up in the Jedi Temple alongside Vera Solan and Trevor Flume, because this takes place about, you know, really a couple weeks after Master of the Jedi Underworld. This takes place, I believe, between Death on Naboo and A Tangled Web, but it might take place between A Tangled Web and Return of the Dark Side. And it's brought up in Return of the Dark Side that Trevor's been travelling with Ferris for about a month. And Trevor started travelling with Ferris at the very end of the Desperate Mission. And the Underworld takes place a few days after Dark Warning. So really, if Typho travelled to you know, got to Coruscant a couple weeks earlier, he would run into Ferris and Trevor in the Jedi Temple. I'm fairly sure he does run into them in Death in the Blue. I know he's in the book. Again, I do not remember what Typho's role in that book was, but I remember he was in that book and had some interaction with Ferris. But yeah. Anyway. But then part of this chapter I'm really struggling to appreciate just because of how it's definitely my least favourite part of the chapter just because of how much I really struggle with it. So you can understand, how Den feels about, I5. It's brought up that he's come to kind of feel like he can't, that it's gotten to a point where he feels like he can't imagine life without I5. He's at a point where he sees I5 as a sibling, and he really just doesn't want to lose I5, and you understand that. You understand that. But yeah, I really do not have much else to say unless you want me to just repeat stuff I've already said, which I'm sure you don't want to hear me. You can continue complaining about the writing of the book and the length of the chapter. So, the writing and length of of this chapter, sorry. So, yeah. That brings an end to this review. So I'll see you all next time. Bye.